Well, I'd love to say this was all planned and just part of the process. I gotta admit, I totally dropped the ball on this one. So last week's video started a deep dive into time-lapse photography by looking at the fundamentals, camera settings, prep work, that kind of stuff. But I totally missed a really important setting to talk about in the process, and that's exposure, and specifically choosing your exposure mode. So before we get into setting up cameras and the ins and outs of the various settings on the various cameras in the various time-lapse modes, I want to rectify that omission and take a moment to talk about just that. Specifically, the impacts of exposure modes on time-lapse photography and how to pick which to use. What's up everybody, I'm Jason and welcome back to this deep dive into time-lapse photography. Now, one of the challenges of shooting time-lapse video is dealing with exposure, and specifically exposure changes. Now, shooting a single image is of course easy, well, except for all the things that make it hard, but from an exposure perspective, it's easy. Nothing changes. You just have to make sure that you're not over or underexposing for the conditions you want to shoot, and of course if your camera has a meter in it, that makes it even easier. Video ups the challenge a little bit. This is largely due to the time component that it adds in having a whole bunch of frames. Now, you might have to deal with changing conditions when you're shooting video, and when you do, you might have to change the exposure, and when you do that, you want to do it in a way that isn't really jarring. Now, fortunately, most cameras these days have some kind of exposure ramping to smooth those kind of exposure transitions when you need to make them. However, time-lapse combines the challenges of video with much longer recording times, the whole big frame jump thing or gap between frames thing, and often an inability to alter your camera settings at all, and very frequently when you can, you can't do it in a way that's very smooth like is implemented in a video system. Ultimately, this usually means that you have to make a decision on your exposure before you even start shooting and then just live with the consequences. So, with that said, let's start at the beginning. What we need to know just about setting an exposure. Now, the good news here is that in most cases, you already know how to do this because fundamentally, it's not any different than shooting stills or video. Now, of course, if you are shooting with a mirrorless camera, what you see is what you get, and that makes it even easier. Moreover, as I touched on in the first video that I did on this series, you don't have to worry about getting your exposure times to match up with that 180-degree shutter rule that's so often used in video, which again helps tremendously in what you can do. Now, on top of that, making it again easy, is that in many cases, the lighting conditions in your scene aren't going to change dramatically from the start to the end, at least if you're shooting a reasonably long, short time lapse during a day, for example. You can meter the scene when you start, and that's usually good enough to get you all the way through. Where things start getting tricky is when you start getting into the corners of the day, so sunrise and sunset. When you're shooting time lapses with building weather, where it's going to dramatically get darker over that time, or are shooting over the course of several days. In these cases, the scene brightness is going to change so much that, well, it won't work well without some kind of exposure adjustment happening over the course of your shoot. So that's the problem. The question is, how do we deal with it? And that's where choosing an exposure mode comes into play. So broadly, we have three options here, and these are use manual exposure mode, use an auto exposure mode, or do something called bulb ramping. Now, of these, the first two are accessible to all of us. It's basic camera capability, auto exposure versus manual exposure mode. The third option there typically requires either a specially designed external controller, so not just a regular timer release, or special internal software that's available in some cases on some cameras in some specific circumstances. For the first two, the normal exposure modes, the trick isn't that they work differently in any kind of fundamental way from what you'd expect if you were shooting photos or videos. The trick is that time lapses pose some interesting additional considerations that you don't otherwise have to deal with. So let's just talk through the options and what they pose, or problems and solutions that they pose. And we're going to start with manual exposure mode. Now, of course, manual exposure mode is going to fix the exposure settings to whatever you set them to when you set them. The camera isn't going to do anything. Now, depending on the camera that you're shooting with and the method that you're using to shoot the time-lapse, you should be able to adjust these over the course of the time-lapse. But your amount of adjustment will often be limited to just the fine adjustments that you can make as a still photographer. So usually this is going to be a photo-sized increment of typically a third of a stop is going to be the finest that you can have. Now, ultimately, this means that you're not going to get any kind of real smooth adjustments. And unlike in video mode, where most cameras will perform gradual adjustments to exposure settings for auto exposure purposes, that doesn't work in most time-lapse modes. So shooting in manual is generally going to give you the most stable and consistent results. Since, again, the only thing that can change in the brightness of the scene is the actual brightness of the scene. However, this process does not work very well with at least long day-to-night transitions, and in certain specific instances where you can end up with scene-created flicker. Now, this scene-created flicker really is only a problem when your selected interval time happens to interact with changing conditions, and as a result of, say, a cloud passing in front of the sun or something like that that's only caught on a single frame or very few frames, you end up with dramatically different lighting conditions that basically translate to flicker in the final video. Now, of course, this is a scene-specific problem, and one way to deal with this while staying in manual mode is simply to shoot with a shorter interval time. Now this, of course, is going to affect your time-lapse playback speed or how much time the time-lapse speeds up time, but it also will lengthen the periods that are potentially dark, so instead of being a frame, there are several frames, 5 or 10 frames or something like that, potentially, and can also capture some of the transitions that make them scene darkening things as opposed to just a flicker in the video. Now, the other way to deal with this problem is to, as well as day-night transitions, is to shoot in an auto exposure mode. Now, as with any auto exposure mode, the camera is going to evaluate the exposure just before each frame is released and make adjustments to whatever handle it has control over to reach a standard, put that in air quotes, exposure. This is that whole 18% reflectance thing, coupled with exposure compensation. Auto exposure modes are often the only way for most of us to successfully transition from day to night conditions or even shoot well into the edges of sunrise and sunset. Using auto exposure also deals with scene-based flicker issues that manual exposures can't cope with. Now, granted, you will of course see a change in the quality of the scene's lighting, but you won't get that dramatic change in brightness, which is going to be potentially much more jarring in your video. Now, additionally, while auto exposure modes are often also limited by photo style exposure increments, many of the processes that we typically shoot with where these are going to be used are already so gradual that the lack of fine exposure adjustments just isn't that big of a problem. Now, that said, using an auto exposure mode does pose some time-lapse specific problems. For starters, again, most cameras, especially if you're shooting just a photo sequence, don't have or apply any kind of video style smoothing and limit the size of the exposure adjustments. So instead of auto exposures being nice smooth changes, they are going to be kind of abrupt and they're often going to be noticeable. For example, in this time-lapse sunset clip, you might notice that the image gets a bit brighter, then continues to get dim, then gets a bit brighter, and then repeats so on. That brightness change is due to the exposure being changed by a third stop jump. Now, third stop is not a big change, or at least many people will tell you it's not, but it is absolutely visible in the resulting video as kind of a brightening and dimming. Secondly, auto exposure modes can create their own kind of flicker problem. This time, the problem is only partially a product of the scene and not entirely a product of the scene. So ultimately, small changes in the scene's brightness or composition, for example, clouds moving across the scene or changing position or changing how much they cover, can impact how the camera calculates the exposure settings that it's supposed to be using. Now, this can result in single frames that are off by a small margin. In my experience, I've found this is often exaggerated in extremely dim situations where the camera can run into rounding issues as well as those changes, or due to those changes, where those small scene brightness changes cause the exposure calculations to fluctuate between two adjacent 1/3 stop settings. So think of it like walking down a knife edge. Sometimes it's a little bit up, a little off to one side, and that causes it to be pushed or rounded to the higher third stop. Other times it's a little off to the other side and that gets pushed to the lower third stop, and this creates flickering again. Now, another potential problem of auto exposure is demonstrated at the end of this sunset clip as well. Notice how the clouds speed up. This time lapse was shot with a 10-second interval time. However, once the exposure times exceed 10 seconds, the camera can no longer take images as scheduled. As a result, images get missed. First, one image when the exposure time is about 10 seconds or slightly longer, then two when it's 20 seconds or longer, and then three when it's 30 seconds or longer. Now, this obviously creates a speed ramping effect as the scene gets dark and the camera is no longer able to keep to the scheduled interval. Now, of course, that speed up wouldn't have happened if I had chosen to use an auto exposure mode that didn't allow the camera to control the shutter speed. Say, for example, I shot in shutter priority or used auto ISO instead of using aperture priority, which is what I shot this in. Now, the final technique that I mentioned was bulb ramping. And as I said, this is something that's not readily available to the vast majority of us. Bulb ramping is a process where you shoot with the camera in bulb mode and then use an external timer controller or a special software on the camera to control not only the interval between frames, but the exact exposure time of each frame as well. Now, since this is an advanced technique and one that I've never spent any great amount of time with, I'm not going to try to get into all the details here. Suffice to say, it does have some limitations, at least on the fast end. Most cameras' bulb systems are designed to accommodate humans pushing and releasing the control, not a computer. And so they do something called debouncing, which makes them not capable of dealing with very fast fractional second bulb times. On the other hand, it offers a lot more control where it works, so at longer shutter speeds. The reason for this is that, one, it can manage very smooth transitions because bulb times have no predefined step, and two, it can do this on a frame-by-frame basis as opposed to what the auto exposure system is going to do. So, with all that said, what mode should you use? Well, my take on this is pretty simple. For most time lapses that don't span days, delve into the edges of dusk and dawn, or are shot in relatively stable conditions, manual exposure will give you the most consistent results. Now, for those cases where you're going to deal with unpredictable changes in scene brightness, you'll probably want to use an auto exposure mode. Now, when you get to that question, which auto exposure mode do you want to use? Now, personally, I tend to use aperture priority. In fact, dirty little secret, I tend to use aperture priority even in the time lapses that don't require using aperture priority or auto exposure, just because it generally is easier for me to deal with. That said, even though the time-lapse's speed can or will change if the shutter speed exceeds the interval time, which is a good reason to pick interval times and so forth the way you want, I find there's just so much more room in terms of latitude to work with when it's the shutter doing the exposure adjustments as opposed to something else. For example, the sunset time-lapse that I keep showing in this video was shot with shutter speeds ranging from 1/1000th of a second to 30 seconds. That is a 15-stop change, and the reality is you're not going to cover that range with either the aperture or the ISO. Now, all that said, a lot of the details here also depend on your camera. So like usual, you're going to have to experiment a little to really know what works best for you in the situations that you shoot in. So, that's exposure modes and their impact on time-lapse photography. I hope you found this useful or at least interesting. If you did, let me know by hitting that like button and sharing this. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you're not already. Finally, if you'd like to directly support this channel and future videos like this, please consider hitting that thanks button or buying yourself something you've always wanted from one of the affiliate links in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.